I want to introduce you to a very special guest. Please welcome Amol Rajan.
T20, the shorter form of the game, has been a fantastic fillip. It hasn't necessarily damaged Test cricket too much. It's led to amazing innovations and, above all, has created new audiences and new financial firepower. One thing I don't quite understand is why it is that so many West Indian bowlers these days are about 15 miles an hour slower than they were kind of 25, 30 years ago. What that region, what the West Indies needs is absolutely outstanding leadership that can take the money and the interest from T20 and find a way of making it pay for the best players to be in the Test side.
You've been able to follow Major League Cricket. What are your thoughts are on how it's grown the standard of quality, the pedigree in the competition, and how it's influencing cricket in America?
I feel like if cricket can crack America, it can sort of make itself kind of foolproof and safe for the 21st century. America has got to understand that 2020 can be a rival to Hollywood, and I think it can.
Hello and welcome to U.S. Cricket Daily. I'm Peter Della Penna, bringing you all the action and insight into the 2024 Major League Cricket season. Before we bring you the final few matches, I want to introduce you to a very special guest. But first, we've got to thank our sponsors, because without them, we couldn't bring you this podcast. U.S. Cricket Daily is brought to you in association with Clyde Hill Publishing and its book imprints, Clyde Hill and Pulley Press, dedicated to founders, thinkers, innovators, and thinkers everywhere. Be sure to pre-order our book on the rise of Major League Cricket in America at ClydeHillPublishing.com. Now, today's episode of U.S. Cricket Daily, we have with us a journalist and broadcaster known for his work on the Today program and University Challenge for the BBC. Born in Calcutta and raised in Tooting, London, he's a very passionate cricket fan who wrote the book Twirly Men, The Unlikely History of Cricket's Greatest Spin Bowlers. And his love for the sport runs so deep that he even walked down the aisle to Soul Limbo. Please welcome Amol Rajan.
Hey, Peter, how are you?
I'm good. Thank you for coming on. Now, what I didn't include in that introduction is that you are a noted member of the Authors 11. And I want to know, is the Authors 11 membership books still open? How do I get into the Authors 11?
Well, there's a very formal process. I mean, I think there's a real danger we overstate my cricketing prowess here, Peter, which I wouldn't want to do. I haven't played for the Authors. I played when the team was reformed in, I think, 2010 or 11. I did play for them, and I think I took their first wicket after about 100 years. But I have to be completely frank and tell you that I haven't played for them for a little while, because, for quite a long time, because since that team was refounded, I kind of got married and then had 4 kids. And there's something about the time it takes to play a cricket match properly, including in the shorter forms of the game, and having 4 children and being married. And those 3 things don't necessarily mix. So I'm not playing quite as much as I'd like to.
Well, what that sounds like to me is that you're the kind of guy in the Authors 11 who drops out on Saturday morning at 9 a.m. and the captain calls me up and says, "Hey, Peter, can you fill in for Amol today?"
Well, if you would like me to make such arrangements because you're very keen to revive your playing career, listen, I'm happy and I'll do almost anything. Especially for a fee. No, I'm that guy who goes into the season and says, "Guys, I've got a 10-month-old baby and a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old and an 8-year-old boy, and I'm just count me out for a little while." So I cannot wait. I mean, I still watch cricket passionately. I was at Lord's last week for the Test match. I follow it very closely. I follow this podcast, obviously, and the amazing goings on in America. But I don't get to play as much as I'd like to. I'm telling myself that, I'm going to take 20 years out of playing. And then when I'm in my late 40s, in my early 50s, I'm going to come roaring back with a couple of amazing hundreds, no matter how long or short the game.
So you mentioned you were at Lord's for Jimmy Anderson's final Test match. How much time do you get to either watch cricket in person or on television, considering all the things that you have going on in your busy schedule?
Yeah, there is a lot going on. I mean, I've got an 8-year-old son, Winston, who is increasingly into cricket and has not at all been forced by his dad to watch hours of it against his will when he'd rather be playing some other game or Minecraft or something. No, I do watch a fair bit of it. I watch the highlights on the BBC, which is still very, very good. And I'm trying. I mean, I'm in a bit of a kind of I don't want to call it a war zone, but I've got lots of very young children, so it's difficult to get to cricket as much as I want. But I have got to that happy age and stage in life where I do know that I'm going to, have a chance to see at least one day's play at Lord's. Ideally, coincide it with Jimmy Anderson's final Test match. So I make sure I do that, and I'm going to the Oval for one of the tests in at the end of August. I think that's against Sri Lanka. So I still have a couple of days a year, and I still follow it very, very closely. And as you know, if you're a geek when following cricket, the website ESPN Cricinfo has so much data and so much information that you find it very hard not to follow. And as this podcast has been exploring in great detail, there's more cricket to follow now than ever before.
Now, you talked about Test cricket and going to Lords and your love of cricket in general. And in 2018, you wrote an article saying that cricket is becoming two sports with two cultures, and you attributed what you call the quote-unquote messy divorce to India's influence, especially through the IPL. What are your views in general about T20 cricket in 2024 versus Test cricket and how they are affecting each other?
I mean, I know you've got strong views on this. I feel I have something of the zeal of a convert. When 2020 was first mooted and then developed in this country, in England, and then when Lalit Modi took it to India with the IPL, I felt that it was a zero-sum game, that cricketers at the top level have only got a finite number of, shoulder rotations if they're bowlers, or kind of swings of the bat if they're batsmen. And that basically, if you get people playing more and more T20, they're going to play less and less Test cricket. And I thought there would be a talent drain. I also thought that just given the sheer financial and demographic power of India, if India took the game in a direction where it was all about the shorter formats, then that would affect interest in Test cricket, because to me, Test cricket, which is the ultimate sport, the ultimate game, the thing about Test cricket is the slower the game, the deeper the action. And I've changed my mind. And I've changed my mind from feeling that cricket was committing a kind of ideological suicide to now actually thinking that T20, the shorter form of the game, has been a fantastic fillip. It hasn't necessarily damaged Test cricket too much. It's led to amazing innovations, and above all, it's created new audiences and new financial firepower for the game, which I hope can help give Test cricket a very healthy future. It does need to be managed. It does need to be very carefully controlled and cajoled so that T20 doesn't necessarily take eyeballs away from Test cricket. But I actually think that Test cricket is so deeply rooted in so many cultures, and there are so many new places, not least America, to bring the glory of Test cricket, that actually it can be a happy cohabitation rather than a messy divorce. So I'm less worried than I was, though, we've still got to be watchful.
In certain ecosystems, like in England, I don't think you're necessarily going to have a, what do you want to call it, a sort of head-to-head competition in a sense, because Test cricket is still so healthy. I mean, you're still getting thriving crowds at whether it's Lord's or Old Trafford or Trent Bridge or the Oval. But in places like the West Indies, for example, there does seem like it has had an impact. I mean, you look at how competitive they were at Lord's or lack thereof, and you wonder, in an alternate universe, would Nicholas Puran have been at Lord's instead of being at Texas or North Carolina, playing in Major League Cricket, and how 20 years ago, the premier cricketers for West Indies were always making themselves available first and foremost for Test cricket or for West Indies, whatever the format. And now you've got essentially side-by-side parallel units. When West Indies is playing T20 cricket, their T20 squad in the World Cup is virtually unrecognizable compared to their Test squad that was at Lord's and it's currently touring England. I mean, you can go up and down the list, whether it's Robin Powell or Andre Russell, Kyron Pollard, Sunil Narine, obviously wasn't part of the World Cup, but historically, these guys have not really turned out in Test cricket. And Nicholas Puran went from somebody who was, when he was making his West Indies debut, he was being talked up as somebody who was going to have a 100-test career, and he himself had this huge ambition to play Test cricket. And you look at Nicholas Puran, and he's done some amazing things in T20 cricket and around the world in limited overs cricket as well, especially in MLC, scoring the century that he did in the final last year. But he has yet to play a test match, which is an extraordinary thing to think about. So do you think that it has affected other countries maybe harder than it has, say, England or Australia, who you don't really necessarily feel, or even India to a certain extent?
Yeah.
India, Virat Kohli and Rohit Sharma only announced their retirement from T20 cricket, actually, and they're still committed to continuing on in the other formats of the game. But Jasper Bumrah is an all-format player, and Kohli has essentially been an all-format player, whereas you don't necessarily see that in the West Indies and perhaps even Sri Lanka or some other places.
Yeah, I mean, and South Africa is the other country, actually. I feel like South Africa's test team is still pretty strong. No, you're right, and you're right to pick me up on it. I think if of all the places where it does feel like the alliance between 2020 and Test cricket has felt like a zero-sum game, I think it is the West Indies. If I'm honest, I passed, despite my Indian heritage, I passed the Tebet test very comfortably. And that, at Lord's, I want to see England rampant and England win. But having said that, so alarming is the collapse in standards in West Indian Test cricket, and so deep is my kind of romantic attachment to the great West Indies sides of the 1980s and 1990s, that I did want to see a competitive West Indies side last week, and I thought it was desperately sad that they weren't more competitive. One thing I don't quite understand is why it is that so many West Indian bowlers these days are about 15 miles an hour slower than they were kind of 25, 30 years ago. Jason Holder, 6'7", is he? Amazing cricketer, fantastic. But when he comes in, he's sort of 82, 83 miles an hour tops, rather, and he's generally sort of 78, 79 miles an hour. And I don't know why that is, that there's been those lower standards. And I think a great cricketing ecosystem would have a very powerful West Indies side. So that is the one place where you'd say, look, maybe T20 has affected the game of Test cricket in a bad way. You mentioned Sunil Narayan. I'm a spin bowling fanatic. I wanted to be a cricket player when I grew up. Shane Warne was my hero. I've written a history of spin bowling, which you were kind enough to mention. And the idea that Sunil Narayan, with his amazing carom balls and his 6 or 7 different deliveries and his beautiful whirly gig action, isn't all over Test cricket is desperately sad. But what that region, what the West Indies needs, is absolutely outstanding leadership. And it needs outstanding, effective commercial leadership that can take the money and the interest from T20 and find a way of making it pay for the best players to be in the Test side. In the end, you've got to follow the money. And I know that's one of the things this podcast has explored more intelligently than almost any other, is in the end, you've got to make it pay for that top talent to want to play Test cricket. And if you're a West Indies superstar talent, and Nicholas Pooran, who you mentioned, is one of the great, exciting talents in world cricket at the moment, you've got to make him think that I'm going to get paid a huge amount. And there's a kind of romantic or kind of, if you like, moral payment of being involved in Test cricket with all of its great history. But you then need the financial firepower. And what West Indies cricket has not had for many years now, I'm afraid, is the effective enough leadership to find all that interest in T20 and direct it towards the Test game. And the only other thing I'd say, Peter, partial caveat to what you mentioned, is that I do think the slide in standards in West Indies cricket was going on for a while, pre-T20, because of basketball and baseball. There's a lot of hugely talented young figures out there who are attracted to America, quite understandably, and who want to pursue other sports. So, I think it is the great project in modern cricket, is to make West Indies Test cricket flourish again. I don't quite know how you do it, but and I'm not capable of doing it myself, sadly, otherwise I'd devote my life to it. But it can be done. It can be done.
But you're talking about following the money, and for me, that's one reason why I enjoy T20 cricket, not necessarily because of the glitz and glamour, but that's where the best players are. I mean, you look at where the West Indies guys are. To me, I got into Test cricket first and foremost because in 2005 when I was watching the Ashes, that was where the highest quality was. I wasn't so much concerned about, as an American, this Test cricket's going on for 5 days, it's too long. I was watching Shane Warne, Kevin Peterson, Andrew Strauss, Ricky Ponting, Matthew Hayden, Glenn McGraw. If those guys were playing a T20 match, I feel like I would have been just as entertained and captivated, because if that's where the best players are and that's where the best talent was, that's what caught my eye. It was the talent and the quality more than anything. And so from that standpoint, one of the things that makes T20 cricket so gripping nowadays, and T20 World Cup or MLC, is if they're paying big bucks and they're attracting guys like a Rashid Khan or a Pat Cummins or a Nicholas Poran, the quality is there and it makes you want to watch. So I'm curious from your perspective how much you've been able to follow Major League Cricket and what your thoughts are on how it's growing the standard of quality, the pedigree in the competition, and how it's influencing cricket in America.
MLC and the sort of proper injection of cricket into the American bloodstream is something that cricket aficionados like me have read so much about and fantasized about, and no one has ever pulled it off. I remember reading a great novel by Joseph O'Neill called Netherland, which was one of Barack Obama's favorite books, and it's all about this amazing Gatsby-esque figure called Chuck Ramkissoon, who tries to be the latest guy to bring cricket to America. And at one point, someone says to Chuck, "Look, there is a limit to what Americans understand, and that limit is cricket." Now, that I've always thought was obviously a patronizing, appallingly rude way of looking upon our American brothers and sisters. And it had this idea that cricket was this cerebral, intellectual sport, which America's sort of brash, if dare I say it, Trumpian mindset would never fully accept. Now, that's simply not true, because anyone who spent any time in America knows it's full of fantastic, intelligent people that are always excited by the new thing and could be persuaded to take Test cricket seriously. But the other reason that the failure of cricket to really penetrate the American psyche struck me as weird is because America felt like the unfinished revolution. The history of cricket is a history of imperial inversions, where the English go and sort of teach their kind of colonial subjects, whether it's in the West Indies or India or, dare I say, Australia, this game. And then those uppity colonials get really good and humiliate the English. But it never quite happened in America for lots of interesting sort of historical reasons. So I've always wanted, not because of anything imperial, but just because it felt like the unfinished revolution, I've always wanted cricket to really do brilliantly in America. And I feel, I've looked at the MLC, partly in preparation for this podcast, and I tell you what, when you've got a finite amount of time and you spend a bit of it on Test cricket, and then you learn about IPL, and then you look at the Big Bash, you feel like, oh my God, there's yet another thing to look at. But I've not yet watched as much MLC as I intend to, partly because I've got young kids. But I'm kind of willing MLC on, because I feel like if cricket can crack America, it can sort of make itself kind of foolproof and safe for the 21st century. And I kind of feel like it would be the kind of fulfillment of the dream that Chuck Ramkissoon in that novel and so many others have tried to pull off to see if Americans can be introduced to cricket. And I know they can, partly because it's a great game and partly because T20, I spent a lot of time with Lalit Modi, the guy who really brought IPL to the world. And he always said something very interesting to me. He said he didn't see T20 as a rival to Test cricket. He saw it as a rival to Bollywood. 3 hours entertainment. There's a wonderful arc to it. Families could do it. And I feel like America has got to understand that 2020 can be a rival to Hollywood. And I think it can.
That Chuck Ramkissoon quote, now that you bring it up again, there's shades of one of our other prior guests, Piers Morgan. I hear the voice of Piers Morgan and Chuck Ramkissoon saying the limit to what Americans can understand is cricket. It sounds like something Piers would say. I don't know if Joseph had
Piers. I saw Piers last week, and I know he's done this podcast. I mean, Piers knows a lot about cricket. I've always had one slight thing I disrespect him on, which I don't want to offend too many of your listeners about. But Piers, in his all-time Test match 11, there's a rule in cricket called the Raja rule. There's 2 Raja rules, if I could very briefly tell you. One is that any spin bowler who finished their career before the introduction of Hawkeye should have 5 runs knocked off their career average, because umpires never, ever, ever gave LBWs before Hawkeye, and spinners, there's a conspiracy against them, which I feel very strongly about as a defender of spin bowlers. And the other rule is that anyone who leaves Francis Barnes, SF Barnes, out of their all-time Test match 11 is disqualified from talking about cricket. And sadly for Piers, he's one of those people. But now Piers is a wise man, actually, and does know his cricket really, really well. And I know he did this podcast, and I think he understands America better than most Brits do. And he probably said what I did, but in a slightly brasher, ruder way.
One of the other things you talked about, I want to fish up on, is you said you passed the Tebbets test. And the Indian diaspora has obviously a big influence in England, but also in America. And we're seeing that in MLC. And the fact that half the franchises have IPL connections in MLC. You've got LA Knight Riders with KKR. You've got Texas Super Kings, Chennai Super Kings. You got MI New York with the Mumbai Indians setup. And you once wrote a piece in The Independent talking about India's control over T20 cricket and how it's reshaping the sport globally. I'm curious from an MLC perspective, with the influence of the Indian diaspora, do you see that as a healthy thing, or do you see that as something that's potentially hindering a more organic growth to cricket and the ecosystem in America? And what do you think that kind of convergence has in terms of an impact in cricket globally, and how it's being impacted in the U.S. and how
That's
that is seen throughout the world?
that's so interesting. I mean, in the end, cricket in America has disparate rather than deep roots. I mean, there's lots of history there. You can find people that played cricket in America 200 years ago, and it's wonderful. There's wonderful pictures and pencil drawings of these events. But in the end, cricket has not penetrated America. And so I would say, one of the things, as I get older, I realise that sort of blanket rules and sort of overall analyses tend to miss the specifics of what's going on in specific contexts. So just as you, I think, absolutely rightly mentioned what's going on in the West Indies. And in the West Indies, if you're going to make Test cricket really flourish and thrive, you need specific, tailored solutions to the specific problems of what's going on in the West Indies. So with America, I think the aim should be, how do you use MLC, how do you use the shorter format as a kind of gateway drug, ultimately, to the supreme form of the game, as a traditionalist like me would see it, of Test cricket. And I think what you need is bums on seats and eyeballs on TVs. And there's a massive, very committed, particularly Indian, there's also a wider subcontinental diaspora, though perhaps a little bit smaller, if you think about Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka. But how do you use, brutally, speaking in a commercial term, how do you use that huge diaspora to get people into stadiums, to generate a market, to get advertising behind the stuff, and to persuade people to put it onto, pay subscriptions? And so I think of it as a hugely positive thing, actually. I think of it as a hugely, hugely positive thing. The Indian diaspora in America, as you would know much better than I would, Peter, is very influential. Some of it is pretty wealthy. Not all of it, but some of it is. And, they retain very strong links to the subcontinent. So I see it as kind of a very useful market and commercial opportunity that allows you to grow cricket. And whenever you're launching a new product, as all of your business-minded listeners will know, it's not so much, is there a gap in the market? It's, is there a market in the gap? Can you monetize that demand? And I think that there is obviously a gap in the market in America, a country of 300 plus million people that doesn't yet have this global sport in the way it should. So there is that gap. How do you monetize it? How do you turn that gap into money? And I think the Indian diaspora is absolutely key to that. And I think if you just get the excitement, the sizzle, the talk of the town, the kind of, the families who are excited about it, I think if you can use the Indian diaspora to do that, then they'll tell their mates, and you'll then extend cricket far beyond the Indian diaspora too.
Well, I might have to talk to the producers after the show, Amol, because currently we have Clyde Hill Publishing is our featured sponsor for the podcast. We might need to tap into what we see in the U.S., where we've got Indian matrimonial sites and money remittance services, and see if they can add on to the sponsorship, because that's what we see a lot in the U.S. in terms of MLC and some other cricket.
Yeah, I mean, I tell you what, Indian matrimonials. There's a fantastic series on Netflix called Indian Matchmaking, which I shouldn't really be watching, given that I'm happily married with 4 kids. But there's got to be some way of getting all of that amazing growth and energy from the subcontinent, which is behind cricket, into America. I mean, what have you found? Are you surprised by how successful MLC has been in its initial outings? Are you surprised by how quickly it's taken off? The rocket boosters behind it?
I think one of the things that has been helpful for them is aligning themselves with the IPL franchises, for sure. I mean, the biggest crowd support, whether in Texas or in North Carolina, has been for the 3 IPL aligned franchises, and obviously Texas Super Kings, their home team. But so many fans show up with yellow jerseys that are CSK jerseys. They don't have to buy a new TSK jersey, and you see that and with MI New York as well. But on the flip side, one of the things that I have seen that is quite encouraging is that Seattle Orcas have taken a different approach. They've tried to align themselves with kind of the identity of the other sports franchises in Seattle, especially with the neon green kit. You see that with the Seattle Seahawks, you see that with the Seattle Kraken, and the Mariners also have kind of a green color scheme. So they've tried to have their roots more closely aligned to what currently exists in terms of the Seattle sports landscape, and that's also been successful. And so I think it's shown that while the IPL alignment model, you can't go wrong with that because you can already tap into an established fan base that's already supporting those teams when it's IPL season. Seattle Orcas management, led by Satya Nadella of Microsoft fame, he's shown that there's more than one way to skin a cat. And
Yeah,
that to
yeah.
me is the most encouraging thing that I've seen with MLC. And hopefully, I would like to see more of that from franchises in the future where they're talking about expansion and teams going forward. And if you get more
And
teams added, I would like to see that. And I think it can succeed.
and what's been, when the 100 launched here a couple of years ago, or a few years ago now, and the 100 sort of entertaining. The BBC's picked it up, got rights. You got cricket back on terrestrial television, which is a big part of how I got introduced to cricket in the 1990s. But I remember talking to, I don't know if you've had him on the podcast, but a brilliant, brilliant guy called Simon Hughes, who's known to us as Yoza and the analyst. And Simon Hughes said that the argument for the 100, which he kind of helped them formulate, was that the problem for cricket was the cost, the complexity, and how long it took. And, the argument for the 100 was that if you try and simplify the game, if you try and make it cheap, and if you shorten it, you can get more people into it. Do you know how's for all the kind of patronising stuff about kind of Americans not being bright enough to understand cricket, which is nonsense? How is that? How much of a problem has the cost, the complexity of cricket, and all the jargon and the length of it been in America? Has it been a problem at all? Was it stopped take up at all?
Again, I personally don't feel that the length is the issue. I mean, you'll
Yeah,
meet so many fans who come to MLC matches and World Cup matches in June, whether it was Texas, New York, Florida, or Barbados even. And you'll meet this guy who dressed up as George Washington. He came down to Barbados to cheer on USA when they played West Indies and England. His name is George. I forget his last name, but he was from Chicago, and he said he got into cricket by living for a couple years in London, and he went to test matches in London. His entryway into cricket was test cricket, and that's because when he was at Lord's, the thing to do, the place to be, was watching test cricket at Lord's or watching test cricket at the Oval. And it wasn't a case of, oh, I can't go out to Lord's because I don't have 7 hours of time in my day to cut out to spend on that nonsense that those other Englishmen are fancying themselves with and blah, blah, blah. It was, hey, this is £100 ticket event, whether it's the Ashes or whether it's South Africa or whether it's India. Hey, if Alistair Cook is there, if James Anderson is there, if Adil Rashid is there, if Moeen Ali is there. I mean, I met some fans. This was hilarious to me. I met a married couple in their 60s from Connecticut in New York, and they had only gotten into cricket the previous winter. I think it was over Thanksgiving. They had hosted an English football coach as part of an exchange program to their home in Connecticut, and they had got into cricket through him. And again, their first introduction was essentially one-day cricket. And the guy shows up in a NASCAR hat. He's got, I think it was a Kurt Busch hat, a big NASCAR fan. He's talking about how he goes to NASCAR races around the U.S., and he says, "Oh, my favorite player is Moeen Ali. I love watching Moeen Ali in one-day cricket." And we went down to watch England play the West Indies in a one-day series. Our first matches that we saw live and in person were watching England play West Indies down the West Indies in a one-day series in November, December. And I can't tell you how many people I've come across who say their first introduction to Test cricket first introduction to cricket as Americans was not T20. It was either one day or Test cricket, but it was a case of they pursued something or they were drawn to it by the quality. Now, quality was there in the T20 World Cup. The quality is there in MLC. You're seeing elite players. You're seeing the highest profile, biggest name players, whether it's the World Cup, watching India, the people who saw the matches in New York. Again, you're seeing Jasper Bumrah, you're seeing Kohli, you're seeing Rohit, up and down the list, Surya Kumar Yadav. And so I don't know people, and it's the same way in American sports. You don't hear about people who fall in love with the NFL or the NBA by saying, oh, I loved watching the last place 76ers take on the last place Brooklyn Nets. No, you hear people say, oh, LeBron James. Oh, my God, I can't. LeBron. Or Kevin Durant or Steph Curry. And the NFL, like, oh, I'll never hear somebody say, like, oh, I fell in love watching the New York Jets, watching Zach Wilson stink up the joint. It's, oh, I fell in love
Yeah.
with the NFL because I saw Tom Brady or I saw Peyton Manning. And I'll pay $250 to watch Tom Brady take on the Giants in the Super Bowl or take on the Eagles in the Super Bowl or
See,
take on the Falcons in the Super Bowl.
that's fantastically hopeful because you mentioned individuals there, and of course, modern social media and technology being what it is, if it is particular individuals that are your kind of access point, your entry point, these individuals are more available than ever, right? Through social media, you can get to know them. So whether it's the Indian diaspora or elsewhere, if you're, a lot of these elite players that you mentioned in the MLC, they have huge social media followings. And so there'll be people around the world who get to know them as icons and as players and then follow those guys as much as follow the teams. When I was growing up in the 1990s, you used to discover a team and then you had your favourite players. Here, maybe you have your favourite players and then you come to the team afterwards, So that's the fact that those players are so available and you can have a direct kind of feels like a one-to-one connection with them through social media. Yeah, that's hopeful. God, you fill me with enormous hope for the future of cricket, Peter. You really do.
When you go to Texas and you see an Afghani like Rashid Khan being the most popular, in-demand player in the stadium, that's not something I would have ever imagined in 2001 or 2003 or 2004. And we're seeing it every day in Texas. And again, that to me shows cricket knows no bounds in terms of where it can go in America. People don't show up there deep in the heart of Texas saying, oh, this guy from Afghanistan, how did he get into this country? We can't be cheering for him. What's he doing? Get him out of here. Get the security, blah, blah, blah. No, they're all rushing and storming him. I want a selfie with Rashid Khan. I want an autograph. And it's not just the quote-unquote Asian fans. People of all races and colors are coming to see Rashid Khan. And again, that to me is a great sign of where cricket is and where American culture is.
Yeah, so I think we could say there's probably no limit to what Americans can understand, but if there is, it's not cricket.
That's a perfect point to end on, Amol. Amol Rajan, thank you so much for coming on U.S. Cricket Daily. We really appreciate all of your thoughts and insights on where cricket is headed now in 2024.
Huge pleasure, and it's an honour to come on this fantastic podcast, and best of luck. I hope you grow as fast as MLC does.
Our thanks once again to Amol Rajan for being an incredible guest and following up the long list of incredible guests so far we've had in this first season of U.S. Cricket Daily. And a reminder to everybody out there listening and watching to the podcast that we'll be coming back for the next episode of U.S. Cricket Daily after the conclusion of the first elimination playoff match between Texas Super Kings and MI New York at Grand Prairie Stadium. And don't forget to rate and review us, as well as follow and subscribe on all your favorite podcasting platforms, whether it's Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and also if you want to send us some questions and feedback about this interview with Amol Rajan or anything else that we've done on U.S. Cricket Daily, you can send us your feedback to hello@uscricketdaily.com, and we'll try and read out your questions on an upcoming episode. But that'll do it for this edition of U.S. Cricket Daily. I'm Peter Della. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.